Why isn't there going to be a national inquiry into the grooming scandal? The government promised some local inquiries. Now critics say they're watering them down even further. When is there going to be justice for the survivors of this appalling scandal?
Well, this subject, Camilla, came back into the public consciousness after Elon Musk started tweeting about the outrage of the grooming gangs scandal in the United Kingdom. The fact that so many young, often white, working class girls were groomed, were sexually exploited, were attacked in the most disgusting ways imaginable, including appalling rapes, in the main by Pakistani heritage men across towns and cities, particularly in the north of England, but across towns and cities across the whole of the United Kingdom. At that stage, Camilla, if we remember back, there were huge demands again for a national inquiry, and Yvette Cooper came to Parliament and said that £5 million would be given to local authorities to run inquiries. And then we had this announcement yesterday, 45 minutes before recess, so 45 minutes before Parliament broke for the Easter holidays. So
good day to bury bad news, basically.
No time for MPs to be able to ask subsequent questions on following days because Parliament is on holiday. Yvette Cooper makes that announcement at the beginning of the year after huge public pressure. A lot of it came from the Telegraph itself, who said that there should be a national inquiry into this grooming scandal, child rape scandal.
Kemi Bade, Norcand Reform, also backing up that claim.
And then yesterday, the safeguarding minister, Jess Phillips, said that following feedback from the local authorities and presumably other interested parties, maybe the police, social workers, etc., that the government would now adopt a, quote, flexible approach where money would be available for local councils to use for inquiries possibly, but also for what were described as locally led audits and also for more bespoke ways of looking at how this scandal developed. Let's listen to Jess Phillips and what she actually said to the Commons yesterday.
We are developing a new best practice framework to support local authorities which want to undertake victim-centred local inquiries or related work. Drawing on the lessons from local independent inquiries like Telford, Rotherham and Greater Manchester, we will publish the details next month. Alongside this, we will set out the process through which local authorities can access the £5 million national fund to support locally led work on grooming gangs. Following feedback from local authorities, the fund will adopt a flexible approach to support both full independent local inquiries and more bespoke work, including local victims panels or locally led audits into the handling of historic cases.
Before we get into a discussion about this, Kamal, let's listen to Katie Lamb. Now, she's the Shadow Home Office Minister who had to address what Jess Phillips was saying, and she actually made a very powerful argument for why a national inquiry should be a priority for government. She, first of all, just started asking questions about why this whole process has become so confusing.
In January, the Home Secretary said the government would conduct 5 local inquiries into the rape gangs which have terrorised so many innocent children. Over 3 months since the government announced these local inquiries, Tom Crowther KC, a barrister invited by the Home Office to help establish them, knows almost nothing about their progress, and neither do we. Why is the framework for local inquiries now being led by ministers rather than by independent voices such as Tom Crowther? Why is the £5 million set aside for inquiries no longer being allocated, but instead delivered on an opt-in basis? And what does the government intend to do about local leaders who say there is no need for an independent inquiry, like in Bradford or in Wales? The girls we are talking about, Mr. Speaker, are predominantly white. The men who preyed on them were predominantly Muslim, generally either from Pakistan or of Pakistani heritage. One of the victims from Dewsbury was told by her rapist, I quote, "We're here to fuck all the white girls and fuck the government." Will the Minister accept that, in many cases, these crimes were racially and religiously aggravated? How, without a national inquiry, can we understand what part these factors played?
Katie Lamb there, referring to Tom Crowther. Now, he's a barrister who chaired the Telford inquiry into grooming gangs. He had agreed to work with the government on this. He was going to sort of spearhead these series of local inquiries. But then last week, Mr. Crowther told a Home Office Affairs Select Committee that he'd been left confused about his role and that he had basically not really heard anything from the Home Office over the course of the last 3 months. So then that sort of suggests that this has not been a government priority, regardless of the strong words said by the Home Secretary in January.
Katie Lamb, it's well worth actually, if you have time, going to watch Katie Lamb's full response to Jess Phillips. She lands the seriousness of what we are talking about here. She reminds us again of examples. A woman who, presumably her name has been changed, Anna from Bradford. At the age of 14, she reported rape abuse to social services. At the age of 15, she is, open quotes, married, close quotes, to her abuser in a Islamic wedding ceremony. One of the social workers was a guest at the wedding. Anna was then fostered by her abuser's parents. She also talks about Shabir Ahmed. He was the Rochdale abuse gang leader. He was a welfare rights officer at Oldham Council. She suggests, are there councillors, are there officials, are there police officers involved in a cover-up? And that is why we need a national inquiry.
How, without a national inquiry, can we know how and why these monsters enjoyed effective immunity for so long? And how can we be sure it will not happen again? We on this side of the House have voted for a national inquiry and tabled amendments which would guarantee the publication of ethnicity data on a quarterly basis, terminate the parental rights of convicted sex offenders, and make membership of a grooming gang an aggravating factor during sentencing so that offenders get the longer, harsher sentences they deserve. Will the Minister commit today to adopting these amendments to protect our children?
Remember, Kamal, we spoke to a rape gang survivor called Gaia Cooper for a Daily Tea podcast. I would urge you to listen to that as well. It was a full episode and you can find it. In fact, we'll put it in our show notes. We'll link to this episode. Her testimony was voiced by a producer, but let's remember what she said about the need for a national inquiry.
With regards to this inquiry that everyone wants, we know how many people were killed in Grenfell. We know how many people died at Hillsborough. We don't know how many survived this.
So you do support this idea for a judge-led public inquiry, a new inquiry into this?
Yeah. It's in each town in our country. It's on a national scale. And I know that's going to take a lot of work. And I'm sorry that it's going to take that much work. But that's what's going to need to be done. We don't know how many of these survivors are dead, whether that's at the hands of the abuser or not, taking their own life or through drugs because of the trauma that they've had to navigate. We don't know that yet because no one's cared enough to ask us. I think people do want answers. I think people need to be sure that their children are going to be kept safe in the future.
I mean, Gaia raised a really good point during that podcast, which was the survivors in all this haven't really been helped at all. I mean, they haven't been given sort of mental health support. For a lot of them, it has had a profoundly damaging effect on their relationships with others, on their relationships with their own children. Some of them have turned to drugs, some of them have turned to crime. They've literally had their lives ruined. Where's the accountability, Kamal? I mean, this does smack of a cover-up, I'm sorry. It smacks of a Labour government not wanting to implicate its own in this, because we know there will have been Labour councillors that were asleep at the wheel. We know that there were authorities, including social services, the police, and other so-called first responders, that turned a blind eye to this abuse. And the ethnic question needs to be addressed. And that is not to say, by the way, that we point at anyone Asian and say that you could have been a member of a grooming gang. That's not what this is about. In fact, we need the specificity of saying exactly who were the perpetrators here. If they were largely of Pakistani origin, why, how can we learn from that? How is this allowed to happen? What role did virtue signalling, I'm afraid of being accused of being a racist if I call this behaviour out, play in all this? That's what needs to be broken down here. You know, Katie Lamb mentioned the ethnicity of some of the perpetrators, and in response, Jess Phillips sort of rolls her eyes as if, oh, that isn't something we need to look at. Of course we need to look at it. In the same way that if it was, I don't know, sort of Irish Catholics abusing children, that you would suddenly have a look at Irish Catholics and the priesthood. If it was largely Pakistani men, why can't we drill into that very specific detail?
Sir Trevor Phillips, who has been a campaigner on equality issues for many, many years, former chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, former candidate to be Labour mayor, he gave an interview to Times Radio today, making the exact point that it is political fear that Labour is guilty of.
I think what the government is doing on that question is utterly, utterly shameful.
Really?
Utterly shameful. And it is so obviously political that if people who in government who are responsible for this, who are in other ways are completely decent people, should really be ashamed of themselves. And because it's so obvious that they're not doing this because the demographic of the people involved, as Katie Lamb, the Tory MP, said yesterday, largely Pakistani Muslim in background, and also in Labour-held seats and councils who would be offended by it. And that's clearly the reason that they're not pursuing this. And it is utterly shameful, given what has been done to these children by these men. I cannot tell you how cross I am about it.
Now, the Home Office have said that it is patently false that the government is in any way watering down its plans. It says that the £5 million of funding announced in January was always going to be made available to local authorities to help strengthen what they described as the local responses to child sexual exploitation. And all local authorities will be able to apply for funding for local inquiries or other work in this area. What was interesting about Gaia, Camilla, was that she didn't come from the towns that have been identified. The whole point that Katie Lamb makes is that 45 more towns outside the 5 that have been identified by the government as having some form of inquiry should also be investigated. And again, that's why you need the national inquiry.
Let's just have a word on Rupert Lowe as well. I appreciate he's in the middle of his own battle with Nigel Farage, but his crowdfunding effort to try and hold a privately funded inquiry into this has reached £500,000. And I spoke to a source close to him earlier today, basically saying the government must not underestimate the strength of feeling on this issue. You know, it might have become a bit of a political hot potato, but the public are enraged by the idea that these survivors haven't seen justice. Because it's two-pronged, isn't it? It's the notion that they didn't really get justice in the criminal justice system itself, because a lot of these child rapists went free. I mean, a couple of them, by the way, are still living among the people they abused. They are supposed to have been deported. But second of all, so you've got a number of victims who never saw justice in the courts, and now they're not seeing any justice at all, even though there's been a lot of political hand-wringing about how awful it was. What difference does that make if we can't actually get answers to the questions that Gaia has posed? She was right about the comparison with Grenfell, wasn't she?
Yeah, that we know some answers there. And the question that we have raised time and time again, not just around the grooming scandal, but around inquiries, people must be held to account, because that's the only way you change behaviour. You need to name people and you need to remove them from their jobs. That is the only way that people improve the services to the public. And it's not just about the abusers and their heritage and background. It is also about the victims, who were mostly white, working class women who were simply not believed by the authorities they went to, as Katie Lamb makes so clear when she talks about Anna.